Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? We love connecting with viewers around the world. What if I told you that North America's most terrifying monster wasn't born from Hollywood imagination, but from the desperate hunger of real people facing the unthinkable choice between survival and humanity? What if the creature that has haunted indigenous dreams for over 1,000 years still walks among us today? Not in the forests, but in the darkest corners of our modern world. Deep in the frozen wilderness of northern Canada, where winter nights stretch for months and the temperature drops to -40 degrees, the Algonquian peoples whispered of something worse than death. They called it Wendigo, the cannibalistic spirit that possessed humans who had crossed the ultimate taboo. But this wasn't just another campfire story. Archaeological evidence from pre-Columbian settlements shows ritualistic burials dating back to 1000 CE, with bodies deliberately dismembered and burned. The traditional method for destroying a Wendigo before it could fully transform. The creature's description was terrifyingly specific across dozens of tribes spanning thousands of miles. Standing 15 feet tall with yellowed fangs, sunken eyes like burning coals, and skin stretched tight over protruding bones, the Wendigo was forever starving despite its constant feeding. Its heart was said to be made of ice, and wherever it walked, an unnatural cold followed. But here's what makes this legend different from other monsters. The Wendigo wasn't born a monster. It was made. In 1878, Swift Runner, a Cree trapper, was executed by the Canadian government for the crime of Wendigoism. During a particularly harsh winter, Runner had consumed his wife and 5 children, rather than starve. The court records show that Runner claimed he'd been possessed by the Wendigo spirit, that the hunger was not his own. His execution was the last legal killing for cannibalism in North America. But it wasn't the last time the Wendigo would claim a victim. Modern psychiatrists have identified what they call Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound mental illness where individuals become convinced they are transforming into the creature. Dr. Nathan Carlisle of McGill University documented over 40 cases between 1960 and 2000, all occurring in communities with strong indigenous traditions. These weren't cases of simple hunger or even cannibalism. These were complete psychological breaks where individuals exhibited superhuman strength, refused all food except human flesh, and claimed to hear the Wendigo calling to them through the winter winds. What makes the Wendigo legend particularly chilling is its psychological accuracy. Long before Freud wrote about the Ed, indigenous elders understood that within every human lurks the capacity for ultimate selfishness, the willingness to consume others for our own survival. The Wendigo represents the moment when civilization fails, when the social contracts that hold us together dissolve in the face of absolute desperation. It's not just a monster story. It's a mirror reflecting our deepest fears about what we might become when pushed beyond our limits. The winter of 1846 changed everything. Sarah Whitman pressed her face against the frosted cabin window, watching her husband John chop what remained of their wooden fence for firewood. They had been trapped in their remote Minnesota homestead for 3 months, and their food supplies had run out 2 weeks ago. What Sarah didn't know was that John had already made a decision that would haunt their family for generations. He had begun eyeing their deceased neighbor's cabin with a hunger that had nothing to do with ordinary food. This wasn't an isolated incident. Historical records from the Hudson's Bay Company reveal that between 1840 and 1900, At least 37 cases of cannibalism were reported in remote northern settlements during harsh winters. But unlike other survival cannibalism cases throughout history, these incidents shared a disturbing pattern. Survivors consistently reported that the individuals involved had changed, not just psychologically, but physically. They spoke of people whose eyes had turned black, whose fingernails had grown long and sharp, and whose voices had become something inhuman. The Ojibwe elder Joseph Kingbird, interviewed by ethnologist Francis Densmore in 1907, described witnessing a Wendigo transformation firsthand during the winter of 1881. According to Kingbird, his uncle McGeezy had begun the winter as a respected hunter and father of 4. After the family's food stores were destroyed in an early blizzard, McGeezy ventured deeper into the forest than any man should go, searching for game that no longer existed. When he returned 3 days later, his family knew immediately that something else had come back wearing McGeezy's face. His voice was like wind through dead trees, Kingbird recalled. His eyes had become holes that looked into empty sky. And his hunger, it was not the hunger of a man, but the hunger of winter itself, cold and endless and never satisfied. The family fled their cabin that same night, leaving McGeezy alone with his terrible new appetite. They found the remains of their neighbors scattered through the forest the following spring, gnawed bones arranged in patterns that seemed to mock human burial customs. What's particularly disturbing about these historical accounts is how they consistently describe the transformation as gradual rather than immediate. The Hudson's Bay Trading Post records describe a trapper named William Kettle, who, over the course of several weeks in the winter of 1893, slowly lost his humanity. Fellow trappers reported that Kettle first stopped speaking in complete sentences, then stopped cooking his food, then stopped acknowledging other humans entirely. By the time the other trappers realized what was happening, Kettle had already killed and partially consumed 2 members of their party. The psychological research conducted by Dr. Eleanor Morano at the University of Manitoba suggests that these weren't simply cases of starvation-induced psychosis, but rather a specific cultural response to extreme survival stress. In indigenous communities where the Wendigo legend was strong, individuals facing cannibalistic impulses had a ready-made framework for understanding their psychological transformation. The monster provided a narrative structure for madness, allowing individuals to surrender their humanity gradually rather than fighting to maintain their sanity in impossible circumstances. In the pre-dawn darkness of a February morning in 1899, Jack Fiddler loaded his rifle with bullets he had blessed with sage smoke and prayers to the Great Spirit. At 70 years old, Fiddler was the most feared and respected Wendigo hunter among the OG Cree people of northern Ontario. Over his lifetime, he claimed to have killed 14 Wendigos, and today he was preparing to hunt the 15th. What makes Fiddler's story remarkable isn't just that he was executed by the Canadian government for these killings, but that modern forensic analysis has begun to validate the disturbing accuracy of his methods. The role of Wendigo hunter wasn't chosen. It was inherited through bloodlines believed to carry spiritual immunity to the creature's influence. These hunters underwent years of training that combined tracking skills, combat techniques, and ritualistic practices designed to protect their minds from Wendigo contamination. They learned to recognize the early warning signs: unusual animal behavior, unexplained cold spots, the smell of decay where no death had occurred, and most importantly, changes in human behavior that indicated the beginning stages of transformation. Fiddler's hunting journal preserved by his grandson and later studied by anthropologist Dr. Regina Flannery in the 1940s, reveals a systematic approach to identifying and eliminating Wendigos. Unlike the Hollywood portrayal of random monster encounters, Fiddler tracked his prey for weeks or even months, documenting feeding patterns, territorial markers, and behavioral changes. His descriptions read like field notes from a wildlife biologist, except the wildlife had once been human neighbors and family members. The most disturbing entry in Fiddler's journal describes his pursuit of a Wendigo that had been terrorizing communities along the Albany River in the winter of 1896. The creature, which Fiddler identified as the transformed remains of a respected tribal elder named Jawan, had killed 11 people over a period of 4 months. But what made this case unique was that Jawan's family had been feeding him, not because they were unaware of his transformation, but because some part of them still recognized him as their loved one. The hardest part of killing a Wendigo, Fiddler wrote, is not the danger to your body, but the danger to your heart. You must kill what was once human, and you must do it while the family watches and weeps for the monster that still wears their father's face. This emotional complexity sets Wendigo hunting apart from other forms of monster slaying in world folklore. These weren't battles between good and evil. They were mercy killings performed by community members on people they had once loved. Modern criminal psychology has found disturbing parallels between Wendigo hunting practices and contemporary serial killer profiling. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Marcus Webb, in his 2019 study of indigenous law enforcement methods, noted that Wendigo hunters demonstrated sophisticated understanding of predatory behavior patterns centuries before modern criminology developed similar techniques. They tracked feeding schedules, identified territorial boundaries, and predicted behavioral escalation with remarkable accuracy. The question that haunts researchers today is whether these hunters were tracking supernatural entities or whether they had developed an extraordinarily advanced understanding of homicidal psychology disguised as folklore. The courtroom in Battleford, Saskatchewan, fell silent as Swift Runner stood to hear his sentence. Outside, the first blizzard of winter howled against the windows, as if the Wendigo itself had come to witness the trial of the century. Swift Runner, a 42-year-old Cree trapper, had confessed to killing and eating his wife and 5 children during the previous winter's famine. But his defense was unlike anything the Canadian legal system had ever encountered. He claimed he had been possessed by an ancient evil that had consumed his soul before it consumed his family. The case file, preserved in the provincial archives of Saskatchewan, reveals details that modern investigators find deeply troubling. Swift Runner's transformation didn't begin with violence, but with dreams. Starting in November 1877, he reported nightmares where a towering figure with glowing eyes called to him from the forest. In these dreams, the creature would whisper promises of strength, warmth, and most importantly, satiation of his growing hunger. His wife, Spotted Fawn, told investigators that Swift Runner began talking to empty air, responding to voices only he could hear. Dr. James Richardson, the government physician who examined Swift Runner before trial, documented physical changes that defied medical explanation. Despite months of alleged starvation, Swift Runner showed no signs of malnutrition. His muscle mass had actually increased, his fingernails had grown thick and sharp, and his teeth showed unusual wear patterns, consistent with chewing bones. Most disturbing of all, Swift Runner's body temperature was consistently 3 degrees below normal, even in the heated courthouse. The testimony of his surviving son 8-year-old little bear, provided the most chilling details of the family's final winter. According to the court transcript, little bear described his father's hunting trips becoming longer and more frantic. When Swift Runner returned, he would speak in a voice that sounded like ice breaking on the river, and would stare at his family with an expression the boy described as hungry, but not for food. Hungry for something inside us. The tipping point came during a December blizzard that trapped the family in their cabin for 11 days. Little Bear testified that his father began pacing the small space like a caged animal, muttering in a language none of them recognized. On the 7th day, Swift Runner announced that the Wendigo had shown him a solution to their hunger. He killed his wife first, then his 4 youngest children. Little Bear survived only because a neighbor, alerted by the sudden silence from the Swift Runner cabin, arrived to find the boy hiding in a root cellar while his father fed on the remains of his family. What makes Swift Runner's case legally significant is that it established the precedent for Wendigo defense in North American courts. The claim that supernatural possession could mitigate criminal responsibility. Over the following decades, at least 12 other cases would invoke similar defenses, creating a unique body of case law that forced legal systems to grapple with indigenous spiritual beliefs. Swift Runner was hanged on December 20th, 1879, but his case opened a legal debate that continues today. At what point does cultural belief become criminal excuse? And how do modern justice systems handle crimes that exist at the intersection of mental illness, cultural tradition, and supernatural claims? Detective Maria Cousins stared at the crime scene photos scattered across her desk, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It was February 2019 in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and the 3rd body had been found that winter. Each victim displaying the same impossible injuries. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, forensic pathologist for the Ontario Provincial Police, had never seen anything like it in her 20-year career. The victims appeared to have been attacked by someone with inhuman strength, their bones showing bite marks that matched no known predator in North America. The case that would become known as the Thunder Bay Wendigo Killings began with the disappearance of Marcus Sinclair, a 34-year-old Indigenous social worker who had been struggling with depression following his divorce. Security footage showed Sinclair entering the Kakabeka Falls area alone on January 15th. When his remains were found 3 weeks later, the medical examiner initially assumed he had been attacked by a bear, until they realized that no bear would have arranged the bones in the ritualistic pattern found at the scene. What linked these modern cases to historical Wendigo accounts wasn't just the nature of the violence, but the profile of the perpetrator. Dr. Amanda Morrison, a criminal psychologist, consulted on the case, identified patterns that matched Indigenous accounts of Wendigo transformation going back centuries. The killer displayed periods of lucidity, followed by episodes of extreme violence, superhuman strength during attacks, and most disturbingly, an apparent ability to survive in sub-zero temperatures without proper clothing or shelter. The breakthrough came when police discovered the journal of Thomas Beargrease, a 41-year-old descendant of Swift Runner who had been living alone in a cabin outside Thunder Bay. Beargrease's writings, spanning 3 years, documented his gradual psychological deterioration in terms that would have been familiar to Wendigo hunters from the 1800s. He described constant hunger despite eating regular meals, dreams of a towering figure calling to him from the forest, and growing urges to consume something he couldn't identify. February 3rd. The voice is getting stronger, Beargrease wrote. It tells me that civilization is just a thin coat of ice over deep, dark water. All it takes is enough pressure and the ice breaks. Then you fall through into what you really are underneath. What we all really are. His final entry, dated 3 days before the first murder, consisted of a single sentence written over and over for 6 pages. "I am so very hungry." The case took an even stranger turn when investigators discovered that Bear Grease had been in contact with Dr. Robert Schwartz, a psychiatrist at the University of Wisconsin who specialized in culture-bound mental disorders. Schwartz had been treating Bear Grease via video sessions for what he diagnosed as a severe case of Wendigo psychosis, the same condition that had been documented in indigenous communities for over a century. The treatment recordings, released after a court order, show Bear Grease describing physical transformations that his psychiatrist dismissed as psychological delusions, until the security footage from the crime scenes suggested that some of his claims about increased strength and cold tolerance might have been accurate. The Thunder Bay case remains officially unsolved. Thomas Bear Grease disappeared into the Canadian wilderness in March 2019 and has never been found, despite extensive searches by law enforcement and indigenous tracking specialists. Local indigenous leaders privately acknowledge that traditional Wendigo hunters have been quietly activated to search for him, representing the first organized Wendigo hunt in over 50 years. The question that haunts investigators is whether they're dealing with an elaborate hoax, a case of mass hysteria, or something that modern science isn't equipped to understand. Dr. Elena Vasquez leaned back in her office chair at Johns Hopkins University, reviewing the case files that had consumed the last 5 years of her career. As one of the world's leading experts on culture-bound psychiatric syndromes, she had studied everything from Coro in Southeast Asia to Susto in Latin America. But nothing in her training had prepared her for the complexity of Wendigo psychosis, a condition that seemed to bridge the gap between mental illness and something far more disturbing. The defining characteristic of Wendigo psychosis isn't simply the desire to consume human flesh. It's the systematic dismantling of the psychological barriers that separate humans from predators. Vasquez's research, published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, identified 7 distinct stages of transformation that remained consistent across cultures and centuries. The progression always began with what she termed appetitive dysregulation, a disruption in normal hunger responses that left individuals feeling simultaneously starved and nauseated by ordinary food. Stage 2 involved what indigenous elders called spirit calling, auditory and visual hallucinations featuring a towering, skeletal figure that spoke in voices resembling deceased family members. Unlike other psychotic episodes, these hallucinations followed predictable patterns and contained information that patients claimed they had never learned through normal channels. Vasquez documented cases where individuals experiencing Wendigo hallucinations accurately described historical events, geographic locations, and cultural practices they had no previous knowledge of. The 3rd through 5th stages involved progressive physical changes that mainstream psychiatry struggled to explain. Patients reported decreased sensitivity to cold, increased muscle mass despite poor nutrition, and changes in dental structure that allowed for more efficient bone crushing. Most disturbing of all, these self-reported changes often correlated with observable modifications in body temperature, grip strength, and dental impressions. Vasquez's colleague, Dr. Michael Chen at Stanford Medical School, conducted metabolic studies on 12 Wendigo psychosis patients and found physiological anomalies that suggested their bodies were adapting for survival in extreme conditions. The psychological component that made Wendigo psychosis unique among mental disorders was what Vasquez termed predatory cognitive restructuring. Unlike other forms of psychosis that involve disorganized thinking, Wendigo patients demonstrated enhanced strategic planning abilities specifically related to hunting and feeding behaviors. They could track prey with remarkable accuracy, identify vulnerable individuals within communities, and plan complex stalking patterns while remaining completely delusional about their basic identity and humanity. The final stages involved complete loss of human social bonding and the emergence of what could only be described as apex predator psychology. Patients at this stage no longer recognize family members as anything other than potential food sources, demonstrated no empathy or emotional attachment to other humans, and showed increased aggression toward anyone who attempted to restrict their feeding behaviors. Unlike other psychiatric conditions that impaired functioning, end-stage Wendigo patients often displayed superhuman capabilities in hunting, tracking, and surviving in extreme wilderness conditions. What made Vasquez's research particularly controversial was her conclusion that Wendigo psychosis might not be a mental illness in the traditional sense, but rather a documented case of human psychological evolution, a transformation that allowed individuals to survive in conditions where normal human psychology would lead to death. Her theory suggested that the Wendigo represented an adaptive response to extreme survival pressure, one that had been encoded in the collective unconscious of indigenous cultures through generations of famine, warfare, and environmental catastrophe. The terrifying implication was that under sufficient stress, any human mind might be capable of accessing these predatory adaptations. The excavation site at Lake of the Woods, Ontario, fell silent as Dr. Patricia Wyndham brushed soil away from what appeared to be human remains. It was July 2020, and her archaeological team from the University of Toronto had been uncovering evidence of a pre-Columbian settlement that dates back over 800 years. But these weren't ordinary burial sites. The skeletal remains showed systematic dismemberment, ritualistic burning, and burial patterns that matched historical descriptions of anti-Wendigo protocols used by indigenous communities for centuries. The most significant discovery came from Burial Site 7, a deep pit containing the remains of an individual who had been bound with copper wire, decapitated, and burned at such high temperatures that the bones had partially crystallized. Carbon dating placed the burial at approximately 1200 CE, making it the oldest confirmed Wendigo disposal site discovered by modern archaeology. But what made this find truly extraordinary was the preservation of organic materials that should have decomposed centuries ago. Dr. Wyndham's team found fragments of what appeared to be human heart tissue that had been naturally mummified by the unique mineral composition of the burial soil. When subjected to analysis at the Royal Ontario Museum, the tissue samples revealed cellular structures that didn't match any known human pathology. The heart tissue showed ice crystal formations that had somehow remained stable for over 800 years, as if the organ had literally been frozen from within at the moment of death. The burial site also contained carved bone artifacts that told the story of the individual's transformation. Petroglyphs etched into elk bones depicted a human figure gradually changing shape over a series of sequential images. The transformation began with a normal human outline and progressed through stages of elongation, development of claws, and finally, a towering skeletal figure with glowing eyes. The final image showed the transformed figure being attacked by multiple human hunters armed with spears and fire. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the tooth marks found on the victim's own bones. Forensic analysis revealed that the individual had been gnawing on their own arm and leg bones before death. Behavior consistent with the insatiable hunger described in Wendigo legends. The bite patterns matched the enlarged dental impressions found in the skull, suggesting that the person's teeth had grown and reshaped themselves for more efficient bone crushing and marrow extraction. The Lake of the Woods excavation also revealed evidence of community-wide trauma responses to Wendigo events. Multiple family burial clusters showed signs of hasty abandonment, with personal belongings left behind and food stores deliberately contaminated with ash and bitter herbs. Radiocarbon dating suggested that entire settlements had been abandoned simultaneously, with residents fleeing so quickly that they left behind valuable tools, weapons, and even winter clothing in the middle of harsh Canadian winters. Dr. Wyndham's final report, published in American Antiquity, concluded that Wendigo encounters weren't isolated incidents of individual madness, but recurring community disasters that shaped indigenous survival strategies for over a millennium. The archaeological evidence suggested that successful communities had developed sophisticated early warning systems, rapid response protocols, and specialized hunting teams specifically designed to identify and eliminate Wendigo threats before they could spread. The survival of these communities depended not on their ability to prevent Wendigo transformations, but on their ability to detect and destroy them quickly enough to prevent community-wide contamination. Lieutenant Colonel James McPherson never expected to encounter indigenous folklore during World War II. But the winter of 1943 changed everything. As the commanding officer of the Canadian Army's Northern Training Command, McPherson was responsible for preparing troops for Arctic warfare against German forces in Norway. What he discovered in the remote training camps of northern Quebec would remain classified for over 60 years, hidden in military files that wouldn't be declassified until 2008. The incident began during a routine winter survival exercise involving 200 soldiers training near Chibougamau Lake. On February 18, 1943, Private William Hartwell failed to return from a solo navigation test. Search parties found his trail leading deep into the forest, far beyond the designated training area. After 3 days of searching, they discovered Hartwell's equipment scattered over a wide area, along with signs of a struggle that included large footprints in the snow. Footprints that appeared human, but measured nearly 18 inches in length. Sergeant Robert Blackhorse, an Ojibwe soldier serving as the unit's wilderness guide, immediately recognized the signs and requested permission to contact tribal elders. McPherson, desperate to recover his missing soldier, agreed to allow traditional trackers to assist with the search. What happened next was documented in a series of classified reports that read more like horror fiction than military intelligence. The tribal trackers, led by Elder Joseph Two Bears, arrived at the camp with weapons and materials that weren't part of standard military equipment. Silver-tipped spears, bundles of sage and sweetgrass, and bullets that had been blessed in ceremonies the Army observers didn't understand. Two Bears examined the evidence and made a pronouncement that chilled McPherson to the bone. Private Hartwell hadn't been killed by the creature they were tracking. He had become it. The hunt that followed lasted 6 days and covered over 50 square miles of wilderness. Military observers documented behavior in Hartwell that defied explanation: superhuman speed and strength, the ability to survive naked in sub-zero temperatures, and most disturbing of all, tactical awareness that exceeded his normal military training. Hartwell seemed to understand military search patterns and communication protocols, allowing him to stay ahead of pursuit teams while simultaneously stalking individual soldiers who became separated from their units. The confrontation finally occurred on February 27th, when Two Bears' tracking team cornered what had been Private Hartwell in a cave system near Lake Mistassini. McPherson's after-action report, preserved in Library and Archives Canada, described an entity that bore little resemblance to the young soldier who had disappeared 9 days earlier. The creature measured over 7 feet in height, displayed yellowed fangs and claws, and most horrifying of all, spoke in Hartwell's voice, while demonstrating complete lack of recognition for his fellow soldiers. The military observers were ordered to remain at a distance, while Two Bears and his team performed what they called a cleansing ritual. The ceremony involved surrounding the creature with burning sage, reciting traditional prayers, and finally, killing it with blessed silver ammunition. What happened to Hartwell's remains was never recorded in official reports. But McPherson noted that the tribal team insisted on burning the body completely and scattering the ashes across running water. The Hartwell incident led to the creation of Protocol 17W, a classified military directive that remained in effect throughout the remainder of World War II. The protocol required all Arctic training exercises to include indigenous advisors, establish procedures for recognizing and reporting anomalous behavior patterns among personnel, and most significantly, authorized the use of traditional indigenous remedies for situations that exceeded conventional military response capabilities. The existence of Protocol 17W suggests that Private Hartwell's transformation wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of encounters that the military preferred to handle through traditional methods rather than conventional warfare. In the spring of 2021, content moderator Ashley Chen sat in her home office in Vancouver, staring at a video that would haunt her for months. Working for a major social media platform, Chen had seen disturbing content before, but this was different. The video, uploaded from a location tagged as Northern Manitoba, showed what appeared to be a figure moving through a forest with inhuman speed and agility. What made the footage significant wasn't just its content, but the metadata that revealed it had been filmed during a blizzard in temperatures that should have been fatal to anyone without proper winter gear. The video was part of a phenomenon that Dr. Marcus Webb, a digital anthropologist at MIT, had been tracking since 2019. Webb's research identified over 300 social media posts, videos, and digital artifacts that appeared to document Wendigo encounters or transformations. Unlike traditional folklore that spread through oral tradition, these modern accounts were spreading through digital networks, creating what Webb termed viral mythology. Legends that evolved and adapted in real time through social media interaction. The digital Wendigo differed from traditional accounts in several key ways. Modern claimants reported that their transformations were triggered not by starvation, but by social isolation, digital addiction, and what psychologists call chronic disconnection syndrome. Individuals spending excessive time in online environments began reporting the same early warning signs described in historical accounts. Auditory hallucinations, obsessive thoughts about consumption, and gradual loss of empathy for other humans. The most documented case involved Trevor Morrison, a 28-year-old gaming streamer from Winnipeg, who had been broadcasting live on Twitch for up to 18 hours per day during the COVID-19 lockdowns. Morrison's streams, archived by his followers, show a gradual psychological deterioration that mirrors historical Wendigo transformation accounts. Over a period of 6 months, Morrison's appearance changed dramatically. He lost significant weight despite constantly eating on camera. His fingernails grew long and yellowed, and his speech patterns became increasingly aggressive and predatory. The turning point came during a stream in November 2021, when Morrison began talking about his viewers as feeding sources and describing elaborate fantasies about consuming their attention and energy. Mental health professionals who reviewed the archived footage noted that Morrison displayed many characteristics of Wendigo psychosis, but adapted for the digital age. Instead of physical cannibalism, Morrison seemed to be developing an insatiable hunger for human attention, engagement, and emotional energy that he could obtain through his online platform. Morrison's final stream, viewed by over 50,000 people, showed him leaving his apartment during a snowstorm while claiming that the Wendigo in the machine was calling him to find real food. His location tracker showed him traveling on foot into Riding Mountain National Park, where temperatures dropped to -35 degrees Celsius that night. Despite extensive searches by park rangers and RCMP, Morrison was never found. His streaming equipment was discovered 3 months later, arranged in patterns that matched traditional Wendigo territorial markings. The Morrison case attracted the attention of Dr. Sarah Littlewolf, a Cree psychiatrist who specializes in treating indigenous patients with culture-bound mental disorders. Littlewolf's analysis suggested that digital technology might be creating new pathways for ancient psychological patterns to emerge. The Wendigo has always been about insatiable hunger, she explained in her 2022 paper published in Cyberpsychology, Behavior, and Social Networking. In the digital age, that hunger has evolved to consume human connection, attention, and emotional energy instead of physical flesh. But the underlying psychological mechanism, the transformation from human to predator, remains the same. Dr. Elena Vasquez closed her laptop and stared out the window of her office at Johns Hopkins University. After 7 years of research into Wendigo psychosis, she had reached a conclusion that would either revolutionize psychology or end her career. The truth about the Wendigo wasn't found in supernatural explanations or traditional folklore. It was encoded in human DNA, waiting for the right combination of stress, isolation, and desperation to activate dormant predatory adaptations that had helped our species survive ice ages, famines, and the collapse of civilizations. Her final paper, submitted to the Journal of Evolutionary Psychology, presented evidence that Wendigo transformation represented a real psychological and physiological phenomenon, an extreme stress response that allowed humans to survive in conditions where normal human behavior would lead to death. The research team's analysis of cortisol levels, brain imaging, and genetic markers in individuals diagnosed with Wendigo psychosis showed consistent patterns of neurological rewiring that enhanced predatory capabilities while suppressing social bonding mechanisms. The implications were staggering. If Vasquez's hypothesis was correct, then every human carried the potential for Wendigo transformation, activated by specific combinations of environmental stressors, social isolation, and existential threat. The indigenous peoples of North America hadn't created a myth about monsters. They had developed sophisticated cultural systems for identifying, understanding, and managing a real evolutionary adaptation that emerged during extreme survival crises. This revelation cast new light on modern cases like the Thunder Bay killings, Private Hartwell's military transformation, and Trevor Morrison's digital age cannibalism. These weren't supernatural events or simple mental illness. They were documented instances of human psychological evolution in action, triggered by the same survival pressures that had shaped human development for millions of years. The Wendigo represented humanity's shadow self, the predator that lived within every person, waiting for civilization to collapse enough to justify its emergence. The most disturbing aspect of Vasquez's research was its predictive power. Climate change, social isolation, economic collapse, and digital disconnection were creating the exact environmental conditions that historically triggered Wendigo transformations. Her models suggested that as traditional social structures continued to break down, Wendigo psychosis cases would increase exponentially, creating a feedback loop where predatory individuals would accelerate the collapse of community bonds, leading to more transformation triggers. But perhaps the most important insight from 7 years of research was that the indigenous communities had also developed the solution. Traditional Wendigo hunting wasn't just about killing monsters. It was about maintaining social cohesion strong enough to prevent transformations in the first place. Communities with robust support systems, clear social roles, and effective methods for sharing resources during crisis showed dramatically lower rates of Wendigo incidents. The real power of the legend wasn't in its description of the monster, but in its prescription for remaining human. As Vasquez prepared to submit her research for publication, she realized that the Wendigo had taught her something profound about human nature. We are all capable of becoming monsters under the right circumstances, but we are also capable of creating communities strong enough to keep the monsters sleeping. The choice between civilization and cannibalism isn't made in moments of extreme crisis. It's made in the thousands of small decisions we make every day about how we treat each other, how we share resources, and how we respond to those who are struggling. The Wendigo still walks among us, not in the forests of Canada, but in the isolation of modern life, the hunger for meaning in a disconnected world, and the growing desperation of people who feel abandoned by the communities that should sustain them. But the indigenous wisdom that identified this threat over 1,000 years ago also provides the path forward. We survive not by becoming stronger predators, but by becoming better humans, building communities resilient enough to keep our demons fed with connection, purpose, and hope instead of human flesh. The truth about North America's oldest monster isn't that it exists. It's that it exists within all of us, and our survival depends on never letting it wake up hungry.